So, hello, my name's Dan. My background is in teaching meditative contemplation, which traditionally really we don't teach in a particularly linear way. We sort of respond to questions, and so when I was asked to do this, the challenge to try and find a way to condense this down into a bit of a linear story was quite hard to do. So what I'm wanting to do is run through something reasonably quickly and then hopefully leave a lot of space for questions. Hopefully it's interesting enough that it leaves you with some juicy questions. Haven't made a PowerPoint for years, so enjoy my attempt at making a PowerPoint. I even got some memes in there to, feel like I'm trending with the cool kids. But the website only let you do 3 and then it stopped. So there's 3 memes. Yeah, so firstly, just to give this some context, I'm going to put it into a wider case to be made that I think probably most people agree that we're in need of some drastic change in the 21st century, that we're facing a lot of pretty serious existential crises. A lot of those things, say like species extinction, climate change, etc., etc. There are some arguments that that's not actually the case, but I think you could at least agree that we're in the midst of, at least culturally, some sort of meaning crisis, some sort of psychological crises where the well-being of people is declining, the amount we're spending on military is increasing, trust in institutions are going down. Things are looking bad, and the solutions to those problems don't necessarily emerge from the way that we're currently acting. So the need for drastic change is kind of there by necessity. So kind of like the Renaissance or the Enlightenment, and you can break that down into 3 things. You could break it down in any way. This is one way to break it down, that there are 3 certain areas that we need to have drastic change in. I'm going to look specifically at epistemology. You could start anywhere. One will lay the fertile ground for others, but I feel that the way that we organize our thinking about truth will then change our values, which will change the way that we organize ourselves, which will change our institutions. So there's just a basic dictionary definition. Essentially, what we're talking about here is what is true, how do you know that it's true, what are our methods of ascertaining truth within a culture, how does that then inform the way that we see and act and be in the world. Oh yes, so starting off here just with a general sense of what we mean when we're talking about paradigms is that there's something happening that you could call reality, and we don't necessarily have a direct experience of knowing what that is. We're born into this world primarily as a living sensory being, having whatever experience we're having. We're not born with a conceptual framework, but as we grow, after a couple of years, we start to develop a conceptual framework of the world that we're experiencing. Then we fall ourselves into thinking that that's true, even though that has arisen from the living that we're doing rather than the other way around. So we build ourselves these maps, and you need these maps to make sense of things. But the map itself is inherently an abstraction of the lived experience that's being had. So there's a little diagram. Yeah, and so in some ways the paradigm gives us a capacity to ask certain questions. So tools can allow us to move forwards, but tools can also become limiting. And so here's an example, right? Like we can look within the realms of what our paradigm allows us to look in, but we struggle to ask questions of things that fall outside of whatever aspect of reality that we can highlight at the time. So I'm going to introduce quite quickly a basic idea. Comes from a guy called Thomas Kuhn, and he talks about paradigm shifts within science. So he's looking specifically at particular scientific subjects, but I think the model applies to any kind of societal change. So here it is represented as a cycle. You can see you start with I can actually do a pointer. In case you can't see the cycle yourself, I'll point it out. So you start pretty much with whatever paradigm you initially have. That paradigm begins by opening up questions. You can ask questions that you couldn't ask before without the paradigm. Then you start to find evidence and data that questions that paradigm. You get a drift from the initial model, which leads to a crisis. It's not always a crisis. It's just that, the more money that you invest into these ways of thinking generally return less results. You cease to kind of be advancing and you start to stagnate. Then you get a revolution in the model and you get a paradigm change. And so then I've also presented it here in a linear path, not because I think it's particularly linear, but because sometimes that's just easier to understand. And there's an example there of, say, one model that gets replaced with another model due to anomalies being observed with the current paradigm. This is also an example of, originally Kuhn's model is talking about scientific genres, whatever the word is, but this is just an example of how the same pattern essentially occurs in every field, including nature itself. So a caterpillar actually eats until it grows to a size that it can't eat fast enough to continue to grow. So the organism itself forces itself into a complete crisis point. Once it hits that crisis point, again, like the situation that it's in necessitates change. There's no other option for it. It would die if it didn't do that. And so it goes into this huge metamorphosis process, doesn't necessarily have any idea what's coming out the other side. But when it emerges, it's a entirely different being. And the paradigmatic understanding of how that caterpillar sees the world has completely changed. So the problem has been solved not by finding a solution within the framework of being a caterpillar in the way that that sees the world, but by bringing itself to a completely different paradigm of reality. So in some ways, paradigms generally, for a new paradigm to be valuable and meaningful, it's not just that it's a different way of thinking within the same bounds of thinking that we had before, but that it's actually opening up new space. And so an example that I'm going to talk to is physics. And that example, well, I can't go back. Well, anyway, the example of the dimensions, it comes exactly out of, if you hear of, say, Einstein, often referred to as discovering the fourth dimension. So that model of the dimensions kind of ties in perfectly with this. But the reason why I'm going to talk about physics, one, is because it's something that I know something about, but two, as well, because in our culture, that really is the way that we think about truth. So all the other sciences are kind of predicated on this. We have this reductionist model that if we can break it down to the fundamental laws, then that's what defines truth. And it's also great because you can talk about Einstein, and a lot of the things that Einstein discovered completely pull the rug out from under our own feet and our own models of reality. And if you try to say these things without having the backing of the name like Einstein, no one would believe you and think you're crazy. But because we associate Einstein's name with genius, you kind of can't argue it, even if you don't really know what it is. So I'm not going to go into too much detail, but basically we had a three-dimensional universe. We had this idea that everything existed within space and time, and that was a flat, fixed constant. And what a thing was is that it was mass, so it had three-dimensional form, it took up space, and it moved through this fixed thing called space and time. Then that opened up a whole new doorway of questions. Those questions advanced science, advanced humanity in a lot of ways. They started to get to a point where there was limitations in what they were uncovering, and there were anomalies in the system. And the solution to that problem came from Einstein discovering there's actually space outside of that model, that what we thought was fixed and constant is actually curving, and once you've got a curve, then you're opening up space in a whole nother dimension of reality that prior to that we didn't conceptually have a framework for, even if we experientially were within that. And I've added that quote at the bottom just to say that that quote was made about a decade prior to Einstein's theory of relativity. And so what often happens is that we design these paradigms for ourselves. We're sure that we've discovered truth and that all humans before us were idiots and that we know what the model is. And then we get an update and we realize that there's a whole lot more going on. And so, oh, there's my first meme. The main shift really that came in Einstein's model was a shift from believing that we existed within an objective universe to realize that we live in a relative universe, hence the term the theory of relativity. So there's a lot of things that we already understood were relative, things say like speed, but once you get into Einsteinian mechanics, then the nature of what's relative becomes very, very complex, including things like the order of events, the locality of an object within space. So once you start getting into that space, then a lot of the assumptions we have about reality need to be called into question. The problem is that when you pull the rug out from under your own feet, you're still left with all the frameworks that you had from the previous paradigm. And so you're trying to make sense of reality in a whole other way, but you don't necessarily have the space to do that. The language that you have is still arisen out of the old paradigm. So an example there is now in quantum physics, which is the field of science that's opened up since Einstein, we talk about theoretical particles. Those particles aren't actually particles. the biggest understanding that's come out of quantum physics in the last while, which was building the Large Hadron Collider, was to realize that mass is not actually a fundamental quality of things. It's just another trait, like charge, which means that the whole way that we have a framework to even try and make sense of it doesn't actually align with the findings that we've got. And so that makes it really hard to move forward with the model. And Einstein himself discovered this not through doing science, but through a visualization, a realization that he could then explain mathematically. Now we're at a point where a lot of the attempts at progressing the narrative, they find patterns mathematically, and they don't necessarily have a paradigm or a way of thinking about it outside of the maths. And then they put it into the Large Hadron Collider and they disprove it and they find that it's wrong. And they don't necessarily have a way of knowing what are the theories that are worth testing. So we're just testing theories, finding that they're incorrect and saying, well, it's still good science because we're disproving theories. But we're spending a lot of money running all these tests, getting no results. And the realization that's come out recently is that we're going to need a much bigger Large Hadron Collider. So we thought we were there at like the fundamental nature of reality, realized that we're not. There's my second meme. So you open up a whole new field of questioning and you get a whole lot of potential that comes out of that. You want to engage in this new paradigm, this whole way of questioning, but you're limited by the old paradigms. There's my third meme, which is the same meme. You can't make another one. And that's just a little aside to say that one of the other challenges that we have is that crises come along. And if anyone has seen Oppenheimer, which is a brilliant film, I think it's the perfect narrative of how these great minds, when quantum physics opened up as a field, were so full of curiosity and excitement, but the challenges of the world at the time forced them into having to solve the problems using the old paradigm, which is a much bigger problem that we have, is that the world is currently being run by people who are operating in a model of reality that we know is wrong and incorrect. So we're trying to solve the problems that we're in with models that we know are outdated, yet we don't necessarily know how to make sense or generate meaning out of the new paradigms that are emerging. Yeah, so, I can use my pointer again. So in an objective universe, there is a sense that there is, this red line represents reality, and there is a sense that there is a reality out there. There is a universe waiting to be discovered, and us as the observer are receiving that information. Once you start getting into relativity and you start to see that actually not only subjective opinions, but things like time and space, the whole way that the universe unfolds, is different for every observer. If I say the word universe, for example, every single person in this room is bringing forth a universe, and I guarantee you it's different to the person next to you. And so there's a sense that the observer themselves creates the reality. But that's not necessarily true either, because of course there is something out there. We don't exist in isolation. And so really it's this funny model where there's this recursive effect of the environment creates the observer creates the environment. And you get this situation like this where one hand draws the other kind of thing, and you can't really point to anything fundamental. You've just got this incredible sea of interactions that are happening in which the experience that we're having emerges. And it's really hard to then do anything that you could call science if you can't find something fundamental to base it on, which is challenging. Before I move on to this slide, I'll just add that there is a whole movement in science now talking about the next revolution that we need is a revolution in the mind sciences, that science usually evolves through rigorous observation of the data itself. When it comes to the mind sciences, we assume that consciousness itself is too complex, and instead we just look at the outputs of it and we don't actually rigorously investigate the mind itself. And there's actually a New Zealander who just wrote his master's on this. There's a guy coming out of the States who is really pushing this idea that we need this paradigm shift. And the conclusion of his master's was looking at, is this viable? The conclusion was, well, as soon as you get into that realm of thinking, it becomes unscientific. The problem there is that your framework of what defines truth, which is that it's scientific, it's objective, it can be measured, it's repeatable through time, blah, 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 blah. All these things are actually being questioned by the models that are rising out of quantum physics anyway. And so now you've got the paradigm limiting the capacity to question rather than the paradigm supporting the question. So here's a little cell. Just trying to think how to best explain this. This idea here, so the red line again is representing the model of reality. So if you're a cell and all you've got is a sense of touch, nothing really exists for you until it hits the edge of your skin. So the universe that this cell is bringing forth is much smaller. And we have this idea that there is a universe out there that's true and ready to be discovered. But as far as a cell is concerned, there isn't anything to be discovered. There is just the experience that it's having. The model of reality that it exists within emerges out of the process of what it's doing. The cell develops eyes. It's happy about that. And the model of reality expands. Now the way that you see the world is completely different. And actually all the senses prior to that are acting in three-dimensional space. You've got compression waves of physical matter. Once you get to this point, you're actually seeing the electromagnetic field, which is what the fourth dimension is. So you've actually got a huge jump. I won't get too much into that. Then once you get to the point of humans, we can actually develop tools to expand those fields of awareness. But again, these are emerging from the experience of being the living that we are that's giving rise to this experience. So what's fundamental is defined by the limits of our perceptions. It emerges from the living that we are, which really changes the way that we think about it from this objective, true universe out there that we're trying to discover, that actually part of the evolutionary process of life is that it develops conceptual frameworks, it develops paradigms to make sense of the experience that it's having. And at some stage we forget that we're actually co-creating the reality that we're experiencing together. So the model itself is not the constant. We can't find a model that's emerged out of the living that we're doing that is suddenly going to explain the living that we're doing. It's an abstraction of the living that we're doing. And so the constant that is there, however, is that there is a living process. Life is happening in all those moments. Once you get into the quantum physics of it, you can't even say that there was a timeline that evolved this thing to this thing. The timeline's actually happening here as a model that's being projected backwards. The only thing you can actually be aware of within the limits of our languaging and frameworks that we have is that there is a living experience that's happening, and we're bringing forth a reality in the process of being the living that we are. So then I've added this long quote. I'll read it out. It's from a physicist, so you know it's got to be legit. Where the new physics lies is not in high-energy particle physics, which is what they're doing with that Hadron Collider. It's not in any of these traditionally solved. This is going to be the newest, deepest insight we have into the nature of reality. It's going to be in studying the problems of life and intelligence, and the things that are also our current existential crises as a civilization. So the same way that if you want to, as we develop these new technologies, we open up whole new worlds of understanding. Until we had the capacity to look into the microscopic world, we had no idea that it necessarily existed. And so our models of explaining reality didn't involve that until we developed the lens to be able to discover it. So you've got to develop the tools, you've got to keep the lenses clean, etc., etc. And so how do you develop the tools to observe the process of being a living being, or the process of the awareness itself giving rise to the experience that it's having? Fortunately, while we spent the last few thousand years exploring things physically, we came up with how to solve a lot of problems out there in the physical world. We can manipulate, we can land freaking rockets on meteors and stuff like that. We can do a lot within this physical space, but also those limits that show that that's actually arising out of our own perceptions. There's been other cultures that have developed these tools to instead observe the awareness itself. So these technologies do exist. The problem is that they don't fit into our model of what defines truth. But we can actually adopt them, and we can begin to develop a clear tool for observing the living that we're doing. Could have added a title here, perhaps. So the same way that you have the cells that I showed before with their conception of reality, at some point they learn to collaborate and coordinate with other cells. At some stage, cells learnt to collaborate in the billions to give rise to the experience that we're having. At one point, learning how to share oxygen, for example, and create an apparatus for breathing collectively would have been the cutting edge of experience that those cells were having. Once they consensually coordinate and learn how to work together enough, they give rise to a whole other order of being and understanding of reality that we call us humans. But really we're on the foundation of an immense amount of collaboration. Also, as another aside, the order of events in an Einsteinian view of the world, you can't actually agree, depending on where you're observing it from, what came first or what came second. So that kind of messes up cause and effect. There is, however, an underlying truth of causality, but the only way that you can find it is if you have information from all the different viewpoints and you can construct them together. So without finding ways to collaborate across these distinct observers, it makes it pretty difficult to then shift into a higher space of understanding. So the next question there as well is, in the existential crises that we face, in a model where these beings are seen as individual units, what does it look like to begin to consensually coordinate, find ways to actually collaborate together, bring forth these different viewpoints? And I have no prescription for what the emerging paradigm that we use to make sense of is, but it's more a sense that engaging in the questioning process, investigating into the nature of the awareness that is having the experience that's being had, will give rise to those experiences. I'll pause there and leave the rest of the space for questions. Any questions?
It's something that's me and what around scientists when they get asked, is there life in space? And some will say yes and some will say no. I always thought, well, we're only measuring aliens of life based on how we know life. And conceptually, there is completely different life out there which we're not ready to measure.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So again, a lot of the theories that are emerging now are assuming that there's at least, say, 10 dimensions to the experience that we're having. The equations won't close until you add that many dimensions. So the realm of experience that's giving rise to the experience that we're having that we can't directly see or understand or fathom is vast. The other thing to say to that as well is that if I was to investigate deeply into what is giving rise to this experience that's me, the more I look, the more I'm going to find the entire universe. There is no me without the sun, for example. There's no me without the earth that happens to evolve in this particular mass, giving rise to this particular amount of gravity. The more you look at any individual point within that, the more what is revealed to you is the entire universe. So to point to certain things that are emerging in the experience and say that's living and that's not, is really just an arbitrary boundary that we make at some point. The same way that there's sort of this emerging idea of what they call Gaia theory, this idea that you could look at the entire Earth as a single living organism. In some ways the universe is just a single living process, and in the midst of the living that it's doing, complexity emerges and these great things arise. And then it's us that lays the conceptual framework over it that says these things are A, these things are B, these things are living, these things are not. And I mean, we've got a whole realm of science called biology, and what it can't do is define life, right? Which seems kind of perplexing. You know, we don't really have any meaningful model that doesn't have exceptions to the case. I think the closest we get is this idea that you have self-generating systems, and once a system can self-generate, then we call it life. And the thing is that life is the only thing we know that begins to work against the laws of physics as we know them as well, that the whole universe is running down through entropy, but life seems to move against that process. We don't really know why. So there's actually a quote that I was going to put and I left out, is this idea that life as we know it obeys all the laws of physics as we know them, but the investigation into it will reveal whole new laws of physics that we don't necessarily know yet. I feel like I could answer that in so many ways. Yeah, one thing to say firstly is I think our current model of consciousness is that you have physical matter, and once you arrange physical matter a particular way, consciousness is an emergent property of that. However, how we construct a sense of matter is actually arising in the conscious experience, and we can't necessarily point to any evidence that there is anything of physical matter out there other than our perception of it. So, the chicken or the egg, what's inside what, is really up for debate in some ways. We have taken the assumption that it's an emergent process, but we haven't been able to verify or prove that in any way. We just hold on to that assumption because we can't prove the counter-argument, but neither is actually being methodically proven in any way. Secondly, again, is that idea that defining exactly what life is a bit difficult. One thing that I will say is that all organically living beings seem to have a sense of volition, a sense that there is like a conscious will that is creating action. So if I am speaking, I'm not necessarily just finding like patterns within language, like a large language model is doing. I've got a volitional motivation or aspiration to do something, to share something, to say something, and then I'm finding the words that will then express that motivation. Currently, the AI that we've got doesn't show any signs of having its own volition. So it's not necessarily self-generating in that sense, that it needs volition from a conscious agent for it to perform the actions that it does. And that could possibly change. I mean, you could take an AI, you could make it have to build itself, for example, and tell it that its goal is to keep itself alive, but I'm not sure that we should be doing that. Yeah, I had another point I was going to say to that. That slipped from my mind. Give me a moment. Yeah, as we evolve as a species, the way that we explain how our minds work seems to evolve with our technologies. So originally we were, made in the eyes of God, and then when we were building, say, trains and clocks and things like that, it was seen as this mechanistic tool. Now, as we move into the computer age, we use all those metaphors to explain the living experience that we've got. My personal opinion is that AI is a little bit overhyped, that the markets are really hot right now. Everyone wants to invest in it because it's really exciting, but the results that it's doing anything actually similar to a living being other than artificially mimicking intelligence. The same way, right, that it can do things like play chess really, really well. It can't see very well. So there's certain things that are incredibly intelligent arisings from the living that we're doing that this thing doesn't necessarily know how to do. The other risk, I think, is that it's trained on data that's collected within a particular paradigm. So the capacity, at the moment, they're trying to train AI to do IQ tests, for example, where you've got to, say, find patterns. It sucks at it. I think there's like $1 million prize for whoever can improve its outcomes at doing that. But because it's just finding patterns within pre-existing data, it can't intuit anything itself. So its capacity to solve problems within a confined paradigm that we've got is great, that's immense. It's probably going to be an incredibly valuable tool. But its capacity to shift into new ways of thinking or to interpret that data in any other way at this stage is pretty much non-existent. But who knows? It's a huge question that's being explored, and we don't really know what is going to emerge from that space. Yeah. Is that?